Hello people of the internet, I'm Nico, this is my 2017 VW Jetta, and today I'm coming with a different video, where instead of doing the normal comedy-based content that you normally see on my channel, I'm going to try something different, where I'm slightly more educational, I think that's the word for it. Anyway, let's see how it goes. The differential is probably one of the most crucial bits of equipment on your car that you use today, with the possible exception of your engine, but that's another thing. Now, to go around a corner, obviously the outside wheels will have to travel a further distance than the inside wheels do. Think of it as a tank. The tank tracks on the outside have to spin significantly quicker than the tracks on the inside in order for it to go around a turn. The same thing applies to your car. The wheels on this side have to spin a lot faster than the wheels on this side if you want to go to the right. And that job of managing when to spin the wheels at the same speed and when to spin the wheels at different speeds is dealt with by the differential. Let me explain how that works. Now take a look at my Lego set here, not sponsored by the way, but Lego, if you do want to sponsor me, that'd be really dope, so yeah, please email me. But anyway, if you look here, this is effectively the inside of a differential. This is obviously in a real differential, it's not all plastic, but you get the idea. It's two gears on the inside, one in the middle, which is kind of a free spinning gear in a sense. It does two jobs, and I'll get to it. It's kind of the most crucial part of the whole operation. And then you have this outside gear, which is then spun by the drive shaft. So if I spin the drive shaft, you will see that it spins this outside gear, this main part of the differential, and that spins the two inside gears here. Think of these as the left track and the right track of a tank, and then you will see that it spins both wheels at the same speed, just as if the two wheels were connected by a single drive shaft. Now, where it gets a little bit more complicated is when I hold one wheel still and then spin the other, effectively mimicking a car going around a corner, you will see that the inside gear here is still, and the outside gear is spinning, because I'm spinning the outside wheel, and this middle gear is effectively more or less taking the role of the outside gear when I was spinning both at the same time. Basically, it allows for one of them to be at a different speed than the other. And that's kind of the whole premise of the differential, is locking the two in place for a straight line acceleration, and then also allowing them to spin freely for when it needs to go around a turn. Now, this next item on the list is not something that's a standard feature on most cars, but I wanted to touch on it anyway, simply because I find it interesting. I thought you might too. Now, adaptive cruise control, that's what I'm going to talk about, is basically your average cruise control system, but stepped up a notch. Think of it as regular cruise control on steroids. Except that instead of steroids, it has a radar system, so it can detect a car in front of it and then match the speed of the vehicle, maintaining a safe distance from it. How it does this is basically with the same thing that the cops use to catch you. Radar is a system that uses radio waves to detect how far away and how fast an object is moving. So, how it does this is by shooting a radio wave outwards, measuring how long it takes for it to reach the object and then bounce back from it, and using that disparity, it can calculate how far away the object is. Then, by doing it again and calculating the disparity between the distances, it can then calculate how fast the object is going. But now, as for why I'm sitting up here, there's one thing I really wanted to talk about, and that is why there's normally a plastic bit that goes across the front of the car that has adaptive cruise control. There's two reasons for this. First off, it simply amplifies the signal a little bit. It also sends it out in more directions, since it's a slightly curved bit of plastic, sends it out in more directions and gives you a better field of view. The main thing though is to save you money actually. You see, a radar system is a very expensive bit of kit, and so to have it further forward in the car, it would be very easily damaged if you were to get into a fender bender. But since it's just a little plastic bit, it's much smaller and much easier, and also therefore much cheaper to replace. The seatbelt is a commonly ignored item for backseat passengers in Alabama. Even though it's technically required by law, at least for minors or possibly even all passengers, I honestly have no idea. But whether or not you actually wear it, I'm here to explain exactly how it works. I have drawn here a little diagram. Basically, this is what your seatbelt is wrapped around, a little spiked wheel. Normally, it's not like these little twigs, it's more of a tooth that's kind of triangular shaped around the wheel, but you get the idea. And then inside, there's a little area where there's a ball, which is technically a pendulum, and you also have this brake claw that is forced upwards when the ball moves forward. So in the event of an accident, say this is the front of the car, obviously the car comes to a very sudden stop, and because of something called inertia, which you've probably heard before, this ball would shoot forwards, forcing the brake claw up into the spiked wheel here, and that would lock the seatbelt in place, keeping you secured and obviously not smashing into the steering wheel. But as my mother would say, one can never be too safe, whatever that means. But today, Mom, is your lucky day because someone has engineered a way to make an explosion be a lifesaver. And that takes form as an airbag, which of course is only really effective when you don't glue a bunch of rocks on top of it to make it look nice. I wonder if that girl is still around. Inside the steering wheel, there are a set of explosives which are obviously set off in the event of an accident. Now, because it's an explosion, that means there's a large amount of hot gas expanding very quickly. So much so that it actually bursts through the plastic on the steering wheel in order to reach the occupant's face. But because it's such a large amount of gas expanding so quickly, that means that by the time the bag is fully inflated and the occupant has started to move forward because of inertia, that means that the bag is actually so unforgiving that the occupant's neck would snap back if it were to actually come in contact with the airbag. So the engineers had to come up with a solution, and they did. What they did was they cut 2 holes in the bottom side of the airbag to relieve the pressure when the occupant actually comes in contact with the airbag. In the same vicinity as the airbag, we find the steering wheel. Now, I don't want to touch on this too much, it's fairly self-explanatory what it does. But what I do want to touch on is how exactly your input on the steering wheel is transferred to the tires. In the olden days, it was quite simple. There's a steering wheel and there is a direct connection from the steering wheel to the tires, which of course means that there's a lot of feedback in the steering wheel, and as a car enthusiast, I can appreciate that. However, as cars weigh just a little bit more than Lizzo does, it is actually very difficult to turn the steering wheel when it is directly connected to the tires. As a result, it was only a matter of time before someone invented a system that would assist you while steering, namely called power steering. First off, there's hydraulic power steering, which, as the name indicates, uses hydraulics to force the wheels in one direction or the other. To get more technical, it uses a pump to force this power steering fluid into a cylinder, which then in turn forces a piston to the left side or the right side, which then turns the wheels towards the left or the right. As for what your steering wheel has to do with that, that is actually what regulates the amount of fluid that is pumped into the cylinder and where exactly into the cylinder it is pumped, given the left side or the right side. The second form of power steering is electric power steering. Much like the world of today, everything seems to be going electric, and the same case is for power steering. Now, the setup doesn't change dramatically from a hydraulic setup, simply it's mostly replaced by an electric motor. The steering wheel then becomes your actuator, which then communicates with the computer, which then in turn communicates with the electric motor and directs the wheels to the right or to the left.
Now we get to the brakes, which are actually very similar to the power steering system if you think about it. You have an actuator, in this case the brake pedal, in the previous case it was the steering wheel. Then you have that which operates the pump. That obviously sends a fluid into the calipers, which are right here, these little guys, which then clamp down on the brake disc, stopping the wheel from rotating and therefore slowing the car down. Now that's all well and good, but a locked wheel is actually very ineffective at stopping a vehicle. Let me explain. Now, it all has to do with the difference between kinetic friction force and static friction force. Now, static friction force is the friction force acting on an object that is stationary, and kinetic friction force is the friction force acting on an object that's moving, kind of in the name, static and kinetic. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Static friction force is actually quite a bit stronger than kinetic friction force. If you ever tried pushing a very heavy box, you'll know that the very first bit is the most difficult part, but once you've gotten the box actually sliding across the floor, it's significantly easier. Now, the same thing applies to the tire. Now, because it's a wheel and it goes in the circle, when it's rolling, this bottom part here where it actually contacts the ground is technically a static friction force because the bottom part isn't really moving. That's staying with the ground, and that allows the wheel to rotate and keep on going. Now, because of this, if the wheel were to start sliding, as I said before, kinetic friction force is much weaker than the static friction force. That means that there is less friction on the tire, which means that there's not as much grip, which means it doesn't react the same way as a wheel that's rolling. Because of this, a locked wheel doesn't decelerate as quickly as a rolling wheel does, at least when it comes to the fundamentals of friction. As for an explanation in basic English, think about the last time you were running through the house with your socks on. If you planted your feet, you would slide across the floor and you'd cover a much greater distance than if you kind of juddered your feet and tried to keep your feet from slipping. Same thing applies to the tire. The sliding feet, that's your not ABS situation. That's where your wheels lock up and you have the kinetic friction force acting on the tire. Your ABS situation, that's where the wheel is actually rotating and admittedly coming to a complete stop at some points. It kind of alternates between the two. And that is where you have the mix of kinetic friction force and static friction force, giving you the best deceleration.